Stay away from my car." The words cut through the cold night like a knife. They were sharp, defensive, laced with fear and prejudice. Richard Caldwell, billionaire and business magnate, stood rigid beside his gleaming black luxury vehicle, his eyes fixed on the figure approaching him. The man who had dared to take a step closer wasn't a thief, nor a threat. He was Marcus, homeless, weary, a black man, whose clothes told the story of struggle and nights spent under bridges rather than beneath a roof. Marcus froze mid-step. He had seen that look before, the guarded suspicion, the quick judgment that said, "You don't belong here." He wanted to turn away, to let pride shield him from yet another rejection. But then he heard the billionaire curse under his breath, banging the hood in frustration. The car wouldn't start. For all the money Richard had, for all the power he wielded, at this moment he was stranded. Marcus raised his hand slowly, his voice steady yet respectful. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "I can fix it." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if the words themselves were an insult. "You?" he scoffed, his tone thick with disbelief. "Do you even know what kind of car this is?" Marcus held his gaze unflinching. "Engines don't care how much money you have." I said, "I can fix it." The certainty in Marcus's voice unsettled Richard more than he wanted to admit. He was used to people begging, bowing, agreeing, not standing tall in rags with confidence that seemed out of place. For a moment, pride urged him to dismiss the man, but desperation tugged harder. The billionaire glanced at his phone again, no answer. No tow service willing to come out this late. He had no choice, though he hated the thought of needing help from someone the world ignored. "Fine," Richard muttered at last, waving him on like a reluctant king granting permission. "But if you make it worse..." Marcus didn't wait for the threat to finish. He moved with a kind of quiet grace, stepping toward the car with hands that remembered every tool they'd once held. To him, the machine wasn't a luxury toy. It was an engine breathing, whispering its problem. He listened to it the way a doctor listens to a patient's heart. Richard watched with folded arms, skepticism etched on his face. "You really think you know what you're doing?" he asked coldly. Marcus didn't answer. He adjusted a valve here, reconnected a loose wire there, and tightened a bolt with the precision of a man who had once lived and breathed this craft. For a moment, the cold night fell silent except for the sound of his work, his breath steady, his focus unbroken. Finally, Marcus closed the hood with a soft thud. He wiped his hands on his faded jacket and nodded toward the driver's seat. "Try it now." Richard slid behind the wheel, half expecting nothing to happen. But when he turned the key, the car came alive, roaring, steady, perfect. The billionaire blinked, stunned, his hands gripping the wheel, as if the car itself had betrayed him by responding to this stranger's touch. He stepped out slowly, staring at Marcus with a new expression. Confusion, maybe even a flicker of respect, though buried beneath his pride. "You actually fixed it," Richard said, almost unwilling to admit it. Marcus gave the faintest smile. "Told you I could." Richard pulled out a thick leather wallet and slid out a crisp 100, holding it out like one might toss scraps to a stray dog. "Here," he said, "for your trouble." But Marcus didn't move. He looked at the bill, then at Richard, his eyes calm yet unyielding. "I didn't do it for money," he replied. The words hung heavy between them. Richard froze, the bill still suspended in the air. For a man who bought everything, time, loyalty, even silence, this was a language he didn't understand. Refusal, dignity, pride unbought. Marcus stepped back, his voice steady as the night air. "Sometimes people just help because they can." And in that moment, for the first time in years, Richard Caldwell felt small, not because of his broken car, but because of the truth standing before him. As Marcus turned to leave, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the street, Richard called after him, softer now. "Wait." Marcus paused. "What's your name?" Richard asked, the arrogance gone, replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe even humility. There was a long silence. Then Marcus said quietly, "Marcus." And with that he walked away, leaving Richard staring after him, the engine purring behind, and a gnawing weight pressing on his chest. He had just been taught something money couldn't buy. Respect that comes from strength of character, not wealth. The night swallowed Marcus again, but in Richard's mind, his voice lingered. "I can fix it." And though he thought of engines, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had fixed something else entirely. Richard couldn't sleep that night. The sound of the car's smooth engine was still in his ears. But louder than that was the memory of Marcus's words. I didn't do it for money. For a man like Richard, whose world revolved around contracts, transactions, and calculated deals, it was disarming. People always wanted something. Yet this man who had nothing had refused him. The next morning, Richard sat in his office tower overlooking the city skyline. His assistant ran through schedules, stock movements, board meetings, but his mind drifted back to the homeless man, who had appeared from the shadows and made him feel human. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more complicated. An unsettling realization that maybe he had spent too long dismissing people based on appearances, on assumptions. Find out about a man named Marcus, Richard said suddenly. His assistant blinked. Marcus who? Richard hesitated. He didn't even know the man's last name. All he had was a name and the memory of dignity etched in tired eyes. Check the shelters, food banks. He's homeless. The assistant looked puzzled, but she nodded. It was an unusual request coming from a billionaire, known for being cold and efficient, but Richard's tone left no room for questions. 2 days passed with no word. Then on the third night, fate decided for him. Richard was driving home late. The city streets quieter than usual, when he spotted a familiar figure sitting by the corner of a closed diner. Marcus hunched against the cold, a paper cup beside him, though it sat empty. Richard slowed, parking his car nearby. For a long moment he sat in silence, watching Marcus through the windshield, the pride on that man's face, when he said he didn't want money. That memory burned in Richard's mind. Finally he stepped out, the sound of his shoes against the pavement startling Marcus. Marcus looked up, his eyes narrowing. What do you want? Richard cleared his throat. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. I came to thank you properly. Marcus gave a dry laugh, shaking his head. You already tried that with money. I don't need thanks. Richard hesitated, searching for words he rarely used. Maybe not, but you deserve respect. You fixed something I couldn't. Marcus studied him carefully. Respect? He echoed, his tone almost bitter. Respect doesn't come from fixing cars for billionaires. Respect is when you don't cross the street when you see me coming. Respect is when you don't tell me to stay away from my car. Before I even say a word. The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue but realized he couldn't. Marcus was right. That first sentence, those 4 words, had carried all the prejudice. Richard never admitted to himself. You're right, Richard said quietly. I judged you. And I was wrong. Marcus didn't respond. His silence was louder than anger. He had heard apologies before, too often empty. I want to offer you something, Richard said at last. A chance, work. You shouldn't be out here. A man with your skill. Marcus cut him off sharply. You think giving me a job erases what you thought of me? You think it makes me your charity case? Richard flinched at the sting of the words. No, he said, forcing his voice to steady. Not charity, opportunity. I meant what? I said, you fixed what I couldn't, not just my car. Something else. I want you to come to my garage, prove what you know. If you're as good as I think, the rest will take care of itself. Marcus stared at him, eyes hard with disbelief. Men like you don't see men like me unless we're holding out our hands. Why now? Richard didn't have a neat answer. He only knew the truth. Because for the first time in a long time, I realized money can't buy what you carry inside you, and I can't ignore that. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus sighed, his shoulders dropping. You want me to work for you? I want you to work with me, Richard corrected. Marcus let out a low laugh, shaking his head. We'll see. The next morning, Richard sent a driver to the diner corner. Marcus wasn't there. By noon, Richard wondered if his offer had been foolish. But late that evening, when he walked into his private auto garage where he kept his collection of rare cars, he found Marcus standing there, his eyes roaming over machines most men would never even touch in their lifetime. You weren't lying, Marcus murmured, awe mixing with suspicion. Richard smiled faintly. Neither were you. Pick one, show me. Marcus hesitated, then stepped toward a crimson Aston Martin, running his hands along its frame like a craftsman meeting his canvas. He popped the hood, eyes scanning, hands steady. Richard watched from a distance, saying nothing, only observing the way Marcus worked. Focused, intuitive, almost like the car itself trusted him. After an hour, Marcus closed the hood. This one's been sitting too long. The fuel lines are sluggish. I'd switch them out before you take it on the road. Richard blinked. He hadn't told Marcus that the car had refused to start for months. How did you know? Marcus simply shrugged. Engines talk. You just have to listen. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. Humility. Here was a man who owned nothing but had a gift worth more than any paycheck. That night, Richard offered Marcus a contract. Not as a mechanic under someone's thumb, but as a partner to oversee his collection, restore what was broken, and teach younger apprentices the art of listening to engines. Marcus studied the papers, suspicion still flickering in his eyes. This doesn't make us equals, he warned. Don't think a job changes what the world sees when they look at me. Richard's voice softened. Maybe not, but it changes what I see, and maybe that's a start. Marcus didn't answer right away. He folded the papers, slid them back across the table. I'll think about it. As he walked out of the garage, Richard realized he wanted something he hadn't expected. Not to rescue Marcus, but to be worthy of his respect. Because deep down, Richard knew Marcus, had already taught him what no amount of wealth had ever managed to buy. That dignity doesn't come from money. It comes from the courage to stand tall, even when the world tries to break you. And in the quiet of that night, as the engines in his garage seemed to hum with life, Richard whispered the words Marcus had said to him. I can fix it. Only now he wondered if Marcus wasn't just fixing cars, he was fixing Richard too. The following week, Marcus returned to the garage. This time he came not out of curiosity but out of decision. His steps were slow, deliberate, but his eyes carried something new, resolve. Richard noticed it immediately. He had seen men sign deals worth billions with less conviction than the one Marcus carried as he approached. I'll take the job, Marcus said simply. Richard extended his hand, and after a pause, Marcus shook it. It was more than an agreement. It was a fragile bridge being built between two very different worlds. But the world beyond Richard's garage wasn't as ready for bridges. Word spread quickly among his inner circle. At the next board dinner, murmurs rippled through the room when Marcus walked in alongside Richard. Some smiled politely, others avoided his gaze, but many couldn't hide the disdain in their eyes. One man, a fellow investor in a pressed suit and silver tie, leaned across the table and whispered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear, "Since when do billionaires bring their mechanics to dinner?" The words weren't meant for Richard. They were meant to put Marcus in his place, to remind him of the invisible lines society had drawn. Marcus heard them, but he didn't flinch. He had lived his whole life with those lines. But Richard heard them too, and for the first time, he felt anger rise not at the insult to himself, but at the insult to the man beside him. Richard set down his glass, his voice calm but carrying the weight of command. "Since when?" he said, looking directly at the man. "Does fixing what others can't make someone less worthy of respect?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Richard, then to Marcus, who sat quietly, his face unreadable. Richard wasn't finished. This man saved me when I was stranded. Not with money. Not with connections. With skill, pride, and dignity. If you can't see that, then perhaps you don't deserve a seat at this table. It was a line no one expected from him, least of all Marcus. For years, Richard had been known for ruthless efficiency, for valuing profit above people. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, he drew a line in the sand, not to protect his image, but to defend a man society dismissed. The silver-tied investor muttered something under his breath and sank back into his chair. The conversation moved on, but Marcus felt the weight of what had just happened. For the first time, someone with power hadn't just seen him, they had stood beside him. Later, as they walked out of the restaurant, Marcus finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Richard replied quietly. "I did." They walked in silence for a while, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Finally, Marcus stopped, turning to Richard. "Do you know why I said no that night, when you offered me money?" Richard shook his head. "Because for men like me," Marcus said, his voice heavy but steady, "taking money means they win. It means I was exactly what they thought I was, desperate, broken, begging. But I wasn't, I'm not. I still had my hands, my skill, my pride. That's all I had left, and I wasn't going to sell it cheap." Richard listened, the truth sinking deeper than he expected. "And now?" he asked. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Now I'm not selling. I'm building. On my terms." Weeks turned into months. Marcus proved himself again and again, not just as a mechanic but as a mentor. Young apprentices came into the garage, many from neighborhoods like the one Marcus once lived in, and under his guidance. They learned not only how to repair engines, but how to believe in their own worth. Richard watched, quietly humbled, as Marcus turned a private collection into something bigger, a workshop that gave others a chance, the same chance he himself had been given, but not everyone celebrated. One afternoon, as Marcus walked to the garage, two men in suits intercepted him. They were city officials, inspectors of sorts, with smirks that spoke louder than their words. "You don't belong here," one of them said, blocking his path. "We've had complaints, noise, unauthorized work." Marcus kept his calm, but his jaw tightened. He knew this language. It was never about noise, never about paperwork. It was about him, about where he came from. Before he could answer, Richard appeared, his voice cutting through the confrontation. "Is there a problem here?" The officials shifted uncomfortably. "Just doing our job, Mr. Caldwell, making sure everything's proper." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Everything here is proper, except your attitude. This man runs my garage, and if you have a problem with him, you have a problem with me." The officials exchanged glances, mumbled excuses, and left. Marcus stood there, silent, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. "You didn't have to do that," he said again. Richard looked at him firmly. "Yes, I did. Because the world doesn't change unless people, like me, stop pretending we don't see what's right in front of us." For the first time in years, Marcus felt something stronger than pride. He felt hope, not just for himself, but for the apprentices in that garage. For the kids who might grow up knowing that skill and dignity could be seen, valued, defended. Months later, when a journalist asked Richard about his growing garage project, he didn't mention the rare cars, the profits, or even himself. He pointed to Marcus, who stood quietly in the background. "See that man?" Richard said. "He fixed more than my car. He fixed my perspective. And now together, we're fixing something bigger, what this city thinks about men like him." The article went viral. Headlines read, "Billionaire partners with former homeless mechanic to build Opportunity Garage." But beyond the headlines, beyond the applause, Marcus knew the truth. He hadn't been saved. He hadn't been rescued. He had been seen, and in that recognition he had changed not just one man, but the space around him. That night, as Marcus locked up the garage, he placed his hand on a car hood, listening to the faint hum of the cooling engine. He smiled faintly. "I can fix it," he whispered. But this time he wasn't talking about cars. He was talking about himself, about the apprentices laughing in the back room, about the billionaire who finally understood that wealth without humanity was broken machinery, and for the first time in a long time Marcus believed it. He could fix it,